The Vikings by Ellen MAWER. Recording by Kevin Johnson. Introduction. The term Viking is derived from the Old Norse vik, a bay, and means one who haunts a bay, creek or fjord. In the 9th and 10th centuries it came to be used more especially of those warriors who left their homes in Scandinavia and made raids on the chief European countries. This is the narrow and technically the only correct use of the term Viking, but in such expressions as Viking civilization, the Viking Age, the Viking movement, Viking influence, the word has come to have a wider significance and is used as a concise and convenient term for describing the whole of the civilization, activity and influence of the Scandinavian peoples at a particular period in their history, and to apply the term Viking in its narrower sense to these movements would be as misleading as to write an account of the age of Elizabeth and label it the Buccaneers. It is in the broader sense that the term is employed in the present manual. Plundering and harrying form but one aspect of Viking activity, and it is mainly a matter of accident that this aspect is the one that looms largest in our minds. Our knowledge of the Viking movement was, until the last half century, drawn almost entirely from the works of medieval Latin chroniclers, writing in monasteries and other kindred schools of learning which had only too often felt the devastating hand of Viking raiders. They naturally regarded them as little better than pirates, and they never tired of expatiating upon their cruelty and their violence. It is only during the last 50 years or so that we have been able to revise our ideas of Viking civilization and to form a juster conception of the part which it played in the history of Europe. The change has come about chiefly in two ways. In the first place, the literature of Scandinavia is no longer a sealed book to us. For our period there are three chief groups of native authorities. 1. The prose sagas and the Historia Danica of Saxo Grammaticus. 2. The Eddaic poems. 3. The Skaldic poems. The prose saga and Saxo belong to a date considerably later than the Viking Age, but they include much valuable material referring to that period. The chief poems of the older Edda date from the Viking period itself and are invaluable for the information they give us as to the religion and mythology of the Scandinavian peoples at this time, the heroic stories current amongst them and their general outlook on life. The Skaldic poems are, however, in some ways the most valuable historical authority for the period. The Skalds or court poets were attached to the courts of kings and jarls, shared their adventures, praised their victories and made songs of lament on their death, and their work is largely contemporary with the events they describe. Secondly, and yet more important in its results perhaps, archaeological science has, within the last half-century, made rapid advance, and the work of archaeologists on the rich finds brought to light during the last 100 years has given us a vast body of concrete fact, with the aid of which we have been able to reconstruct the material civilization of the Viking period far more satisfactorily than we could from the scattered and fragmentary notices found in the sagas and elsewhere. The resultant picture calls for description later, but it is well to remember from the outset that it is a very different one from that commonly associated with the term Viking. With this word of explanation and note of warning, we may proceed to our main subject. End of introduction. Chapter 1. Causes of the Viking movement. The period of Scandinavian history to which the term Viking is applied extends roughly from the middle of the 8th to the end of the 10th or the first half of the 11th century. Its commencement was marked by the raids of Scandinavian freebooters upon the coasts of England, western Scotland and Ireland, and upon Frankish territory. Its climax was reached when in the course of the 9th and 10th centuries Scandinavian rule was established in Ireland, Man and the Western Islands, the northern and midland districts of England, Normandy, and a great part of Russia. Its close was marked by the consolidation of the Scandinavian kingdoms in the late 10th and early 11th centuries, under such mighty sovereigns as Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf the Holy in Norway, Olaf Skotkonung in Sweden, and greatest of all, King Knut in Denmark, who for a brief time united the whole of Scandinavia and a great part of the British Isles in one vast confederacy. The extent and importance of the movement is indicated from the first by the almost simultaneous appearance of trouble in England, on the coast of France, and on the Eider boundary between Denmark and the Frankish Empire. In the reign of Beorhtric, king of Wessex (786 to 802), 3 ships of the Northmen coming from Horthaland around Hardanger Fjord landed near Dorchester. In June 793 Lindisfarne was sacked. In March 800 Charlemagne found himself compelled to equip a fleet and establish a stronger coastguard to defend the Frankish coast against the attacks of the Northmen, and from 777 onwards, when the Saxon patriot Widukind took refuge with the Danish king Sigefridus (Old Norse Sigrodr), there was almost constant friction along the land boundary between Denmark and the Frankish Empire. The outburst of hostile activity had been preceded by considerable intercourse of a varied character between Scandinavia and the countries of Western Europe. Early in the 6th century, the Danes, or according to another authority, the Gotar from Gotaland in South Sweden, invaded Frisia under their king Chochilaicus. Reference is made to this raid in the story of Hygelac, king of the Geatas, in Beowulf. Professor Zimmer suggested that the attacks of unknown pirates on the island of Egg in the Hebrides and on Tory Island off Donegal, described in certain Irish annals of the 7th century, were really the work of Scandinavian raiders. The evidence of Irish legend and saga goes to prove that in the same century Irish anchorites settled in the Shetlands, but were later compelled by the arrival of Scandinavian settlers to move on to the lonely Faroes. Here they were not to be left in peace, for the Irish geographer Dicuil, writing in 825, tells us that the Faroes had then been deserted by the monks for some 30 years owing to the raids of Northmen pirates. Dr. Jacobson has shown that the forms of place names in the Shetlands point very definitively to a settlement from Scandinavia in pre-Viking days, before 700, while the sculptured stones of Gothland show already at the end of the 7th century clear evidence of Celtic art influence. Possibly also merchants of Scandinavian origin were already settled in the Frankish Empire, and it is certain that there was considerable trade between Scandinavia and the West. Most of the intercourse thus demonstrated was slow in development, peaceful and civilizing in character. How came it that in the latter years of the 8th century this intercourse was suddenly strengthened and intensified, while at the same time it underwent a great change both in methods and character? The traditional explanation is that given by Dudo and by William of Jumièges in their histories of the settlement of Normandy, and by Saxo in his account of Danish settlements in Baltic lands in the 10th century, viz. That the population of Scandinavia had outgrown its means of support, and that enforced emigration was the result. There may be a certain element of truth in the tradition, but when it says that this excess of population was due to polygamy, we have every reason to doubt it. Polygamy does not lead to an over-rapid growth of population as a whole, and it is fairly certain that it was practised only by the ruling classes in Scandinavia. It is quite possible, however, that the large number of sons in the ruling families made it necessary for the younger ones to go forth and gain for themselves fresh territories in new lands. A clearer light is perhaps thrown on the matter if we examine the political conditions of the Scandinavian countries at this time. In Norway we find that the concentration of kingly authority in the hands of Harold Fairhair after the middle of the 9th century led many of the more independent spirits to leave Norway and adopt a Viking life in the west or to settle in new homes in Iceland. So strong was the spirit of independence that when Harold Fairhair received the submission of the Vikings of the west after the battle of Hafrsfjord, many of them, rather than endure even a shadowy overlordship, abandoned their Viking life and settled down to peaceful independence in Iceland. It is quite possible that earlier attempts at consolidation on the part of previous petty Norwegian kings may have had similar results. Of the condition of Sweden we know practically nothing, but we have sufficient information about the course of events in Denmark at this time to see that it probably tended to hasten the development of the Viking movement. Throughout the first half of the 9th century there were repeated dynastic struggles, accompanied probably by the exile, voluntary or forced, of many members of the rival factions. External causes also were certainly not without influence. From the 6th century down to the middle of the 8th, the Frisians were the great naval and trading power of northwest Europe. They had probably taken some part in the conquest of England, and during the 7th and 8th centuries the whole of the coast of the Netherlands, from the Scheldt to the Weser, was in their hands. Their trade was extensive, their chief city being Duurstede, a few miles southeast of Utrecht. The northward expansion of the Franks brought them into collision with the Frisians in the 7th century. The struggle was long and fierce, but in the end the Frisians were defeated by Charles Martel in 734 and finally subjugated by Charlemagne in 785. The crushing of Frisian naval power and the crippling of their trade probably played no unimportant part in facilitating the Scandinavian advance, and it is curious to note that while there is considerable archaeological evidence for peaceful intercourse between the west coast of Norway and Frisian lands in the 8th century, the evidence seems to come to an end about the year 800, just when Frisian power finally declined. There can be no doubt also that the conquest of the Saxons by Charlemagne at the close of the 8th century, bringing Franks and Danes face to face along the Eider boundary, made the latter uneasy. There has been much arguing to and fro of the question as to the respective shares taken by Danes and Norwegians in the Viking movement. That of the Swedes can fortunately be determined with a good deal more certainty. The Swedes were for the most part interested only in Eastern Europe, and there by way of trade rather than of battle. We learn from runic inscriptions and other sources that some Swedes did visit England and the West, but these visits were due to individual rather than national activity. The question as between Dane and Norwegian has been to some extent made more difficult of settlement through the national prejudices of Scandinavian scholars, e.g. Danes for the most part decide in favour of the Danish origin of Rollo of Normandy, while Norwegians decide in favour of his Norwegian birth. Such differences of opinion are, unfortunately, only too often possible owing to the scantiness of the material upon which we have to base our conclusions. Medieval chroniclers were for the most part unable or unwilling to distinguish between Danes and Norwegians. They were all alike Nordmanni to them, and the term Dani is practically interchangeable with it. The vagueness of their ethnographic knowledge is manifest when we find the Norman Dudo at the beginning of the 11th century, tracing back the Danai, or Daci, to an original home in Dacia. The Irish annalist did, however, draw a very definite distinction between Norwegians and Danes, Fingeil and Dubgeil, as they called them, white and black foreigners respectively. They seem never to confuse them, but exactly on what grounds they gave them their distinguishing epithets it is now impossible to determine. They do not correspond to any known ethnographical differences, and the only other reasonable suggestion which has been offered is that the terms are used to describe some difference of armour or equipment as yet unknown to us. The Irish annals also distinguish between Daunites or Danes and Lochlans or men from Lochlan, i.e. Norway. But again the origin of the term Lochlan as applied to Norway is obscure. The writers of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle seem to use the term Northmen very definitely of Norwegians, just as Alfred does in his translation of Orosius, but the term Dene came to be used more vaguely and uncertainly. It is only very rarely that the chroniclers vouchsafe us precise information as to the home of any particular group of Viking raiders. We have already mentioned the presence of Norwegians from Horthaland in England at the very opening of the movement. Once we hear of Westfaldingi, i.e. men from Vestfold in South Norway, in an account of attacks on Aquitaine, and in one passage the Vikings are called Skaldingi, but it is disputed whether this means Vikings who had been quartering themselves in the valley of the Scheldt, or is a term applied to the Danes from the name of their royal family, viz. the Skjoldungar. Speaking roughly, we may however assert that Ireland, Scotland and the Western Islands were almost entirely in the hands of Norwegian settlers (Danish attacks on Ireland failed for the most part). Northumbria was Norwegian, but East Anglia and the Five Boroughs were Danish. The attacks on France and the Netherlands were due both to Norwegians and Danes, probably with the preponderance of the latter, while Danes and Swedes alone settled in Baltic lands. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2. The Viking movement down to the middle of the 9th century. England was possibly the scene of the earliest Viking raids, but after the Dorchester raid, the sack of Lindisfarne in 793, and the devastation of the monastery of St. Paul's at Jarrow in 794, we hear nothing more of Vikings in England until 835. The fate of Ireland was different. Attacks began almost at the same time as in England and continued without intermission. Vikings sailed round the west coast of Scotland. Skye and then Lambay Island off Dublin were invaded in 795. Glamorganshire was ravaged in the same year, and the Isle of Man was attacked in 798. Iona was plundered in 802 and again in 806. In 807 invaders appeared off the coast of Sligo and made their way inland as far as Roscommon, and in 811 Munster was plundered. In 821 the Howth Peninsula near Dublin and two small islands in Wexford Haven were ravaged. The Vikings had completely encircled Ireland with their fleets, and by the year 834 they had made their way well into the interior of the island, so that none were safe from their attacks. They no longer contented themselves with isolated raids. Large fleets began to visit Ireland and to anchor in the numerous loughs and harbours with which the coast abounds. Thence they made lengthy raids on the surrounding country and often strengthened their base by building forts on the shore of the loughs or harbours in which they had established themselves. It was in this way that Dublin, Waterford and Limerick first rose to importance. Of the leaders of the Vikings at this time there is only one whose figure stands out at all clearly, and that is Turges (Old Norse Thorgestur), who first appeared in 832 at the sack of Armagh. He had come to Ireland with a great and royal fleet and assumed the sovereignty over the foreigners in Erin. He had fleets on Lough Neagh, at Louth and on Lough Ray, and raided the country as far south as the Meath district. Turges was not the only invader at this time. Indeed, so numerous were the invading hosts that the chronicles tell us After this there came great sea-cast floods of foreigners into Erin, so that there was not a point thereof without a fleet. The power of Turges culminated in 841 when he drove the abbot of Armagh into exile, usurped the abbacy and exercised the sovereignty of North Ireland. At the same time his wife Ota (Old Norse Auðr) profaned the monastery of Clonmacnoise and gave audience, probably as a vulva or prophetess, upon the high altar. 3 years later Turges was captured by the Irish and drowned in Loch Owl (Co Westmeath). The early attacks on England and the first invasion of Ireland were alike due to Norsemen rather than Danes. This is evident from their general course, from the explicit statement of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, and from the fact that the first arrival of Danes in Ireland is definitely recorded in the year 849. The attack on Dorchester (circa 786 to 802), lying as it does near the centre of the south coast of England, is somewhat strange if it is assigned to the traditional date, viz. 787, but there is no authority for this, and if it is placed at any date nearer to 802 before which it must have taken place, it is probable that the attack may be explained as an extension of Viking raids down St George's Channel and round the southwest corner of England. In 835 the attacks on England were renewed after an interval of 40 years, but as they now stand in close connection with contemporary invasions of Frankish territory, there is every reason to believe that they were of Danish rather than of Norse origin. The attacks began in the south and west, but they soon spread to East Anglia and Lindsey. In 842 the same army ravaged London, Etaples and Rochester. In 851 Aethelstan of Kent defeated the Danes at sea in one of the rare battles fought with them on their own element, and in the same year they remained for the winter in Thanet, probably owing to the loss of their ships. The size and importance of these attacks may be gauged from the fact that in this year a fleet of some 350 Danish ships sailed up the Thames. It was probably that same fleet, with slightly diminished numbers, which in 852 ravaged Frisia and then sailed round the British Isles, came to Ireland and captured Dublin. In 855 the Danes wintered for the first time in Sheppey, and we reach the same point in the development of their attacks on England to which they had already attained in Ireland. We pass away from the period of raiding. The Danes now came prepared to stay for several years at a time and to carry on their attacks with unceasing persistency. The course of events in the Frankish Empire ran on much the same lines as in England and Ireland during these years, except that here trouble arose on the land boundary between Denmark and the Franks, as well as on the sea coast. Alarmed by the conquest of the Saxons, the Danish king Guðröðr collected a fleet at Slesvig, and in 808 he crossed the Eider and attacked the Abodriti in Mecklenburg-Schwerin, a Slavonic tribe in alliance with the Franks. He also sent a fleet of some 200 vessels to ravage the coast of Frisia, laid claim to that district and to Saxony north of the Elbe, and threatened to attack Charlemagne in his own capital. The emperor was preparing to resist him when news arrived (810) of the death of Guðröðr at the hands of one of his followers and the consequent dispersal of the Danish fleet. Soon after, disputes over the succession arose between the family of Guðröðr and that of an earlier king, Harold. Ultimately the contest resolved itself into one between the sons of Guðröðr, especially one Hórik (Old Norse Hárekr) and a certain Harold. It lasted for several years, the sons of Guðröðr for the most part maintaining their hold on Denmark. At one time during the struggle Harold and his brother Ragnfröðr went to Vestfold in Norway, the extreme district of their realm, whose chief and peoples were refusing to be made subject to them, and gained their submission, showing clearly that at this time Denmark and southern Norway were under one rule and rendering probable the identification of Guðröðr with Guðröðr the Yngling, who about this time was slain by a retainer in Stifla Sound on the south coast of Norway. This king ruled over Vestfold, half Vingulmörk and perhaps Agðir. Both parties were anxious to secure the support of the Emperor Lewis, and in the end Harold gained his help by accepting baptism at Mainz in 826. He promised to promote the cause of Christianity in Denmark, while Lewis in return granted him the district of Rüstringen in Frisia as a place of retreat in case of necessity. The Danes thereby gained their first foothold within the empire. Sufficient has been said of the relation between Denmark and the empire on its land boundary. We must now say something of the attacks made by sea. The first were made in 799 on the coast of Aquitaine, and they were probably due to raiders from Ireland who followed a well-known trade route from South Ireland to the ports of southern France. In 800 Charlemagne inspected the coast from the Somme to the Seine and gave orders for the equipment of a fleet and the strengthening of the coastguard against Northmen pirates. When Guðröðr's fleet plundered the islands off the Frisian coast in 810, Charlemagne gave orders for his fleet to be strengthened once more, but the results were meagre in the extreme. The passage of the Channel was no longer safe, and year after year, from some time before 819, Vikings harried the island of Noirmoutier at the mouth of the Loire, commanding the port of Nantes and the extensive salt trade of the district. The island of Ré, opposite La Rochelle, was raided in similar fashion. The Frankish Empire was free from attack between the years 814 and 833. During the same time the English coast was also unvisited, and it is probable that the struggles for the succession in Denmark had for the time being reduced that kingdom to inactivity. About the year 830 the Danish king Hárekr seems to have established himself firmly on the throne. Well, on the other hand, the Emperor Lewis was troubled by the ambition of his sons Lewis, Pippin and Lothair. It is probably no chance coincidence that these events synchronized with the renewal of Viking attacks on Frisia. Throughout their history the Vikings showed themselves well informed of the changing political conditions of the countries which they visited and ready to make the utmost use of the opportunities which these might give for successful invasion. Frisia was the main point of attack during the next few years. 4 times was the rich trading town of Duurstede ravaged. Fleets sailed up the Veldt, the Maas and the Scheldt. Antwerp was burned and the island of Walcheren plundered, so that by the year 840 the greater part of Frisia north of the Vlie was in Danish hands, and so it remained till the end of the century. The Danish king Hárekr repeatedly denied all complicity in these raids and even promised to punish the raiders, but it is impossible to tell how far his denials were genuine. Equally difficult is it to say how far Harold, in his Frisian home, was responsible for these attacks. The annalists charge him with complicity, but Lewis seems to have thought it best to bind him by fresh gifts and (probably about 839) granted the district round Duurstede itself to him and his brother Roric (Old Norse Hroerekr), on condition that they helped to ward off Viking attacks. All the efforts of the emperor to equip a fleet or to defend the coast were to no purpose, and there was even a suspicion that the Frisian populace were in sympathy with the Vikings. So great was the terror of attack that when in 839 a Byzantine mission, including some Rus or Swedes from Russia, visited the emperor at Ingelheim, the Swedes were for a time detained under suspicion as spies. On the death of Lewis the Pious in 840, things went from bad to worse. The division of the empire in 843 gave the coast from the Eider to the Weser to Lewis, from the Weser to the Scheldt to Lothair, and the rest to Charles, removing all possibility of a united and organised defence, and soon these princes entered on the fatal policy of calling in the Vikings to assist them in their quarrels. Thus Lothair in 841 endeavoured to bind Harold to his cause by a grant of the islands of Walcheren, and Harold is found in the following year with Lothair's army on the Moselle. The Viking expeditions to England and France stand now in close connection. In 841 the valley of the Seine was ravaged as far as Rouen. In 842 Étaples in Picardy was destroyed by a fleet from England, while in 843 Nantes fell a prey to their attacks. From their permanent quarters at Noirmoutier, the Vikings sailed up the Garonne and penetrated inland as far as Toulouse. In 844 we hear from Arab historians of their vessels swarming on the coasts of Spain like dark red seabirds, but while they effected landings at Lisbon and Cadiz and at Arzilla in Morocco and captured Seville, with the exception of its citadel, the Musulman resistance was too stout for them to effect much. As a result of this expedition the Emir of Cordova, Abd ar-Rahman II, sent an embassy to the king of the Majus (i.e. the Magi or the heathen, one of the commonest Arab names for the Vikings). The ambassador found the king living in an island 3 days' journey from the mainland, but we are told that the heathen occupied many other neighbouring isles and the mainland also. He was courteously received by the king and became an especial favourite with the queen Naud (Old Norse Auðr). His companions were alarmed at the intimacy and as a result the ambassador paid less frequent visits to court. The queen asked him why, and when he told her the reason she said that, owing to perfect freedom of divorce, there was no jealousy among the Majus. The details of the story are too vague to admit of certainty, but it would seem as if the embassy had visited the court of the great Turges and his equally remarkable wife Auðr in Ireland, or perhaps that of Olaf the White and his wife Auðr. In 845 Hárekr of Denmark sailed up the Elbe and destroyed Hamburg, while in the same year the dreaded Ragnar Lothbrok, most famous of all Vikings, sailed up the Seine as far as Paris. While on its retreat from Paris, after the usual devastation, a strange and deadly disease, possibly some form of dysentery due to scantiness of food resulting from a hard winter, broke out in the Danish army. Various legends arose in connection with this event, and it finds a curious echo in the story told by Saxo Grammaticus of an expedition made by Ragnar among the Biarmians (in northern Russia), when that people by their prayers called down a plague of dysentery upon the Danes, in which large numbers perished. In the end the historical plague was stayed when Hárekr commanded the Vikings on their return to Denmark to refrain from flesh and meat for 14 days. Whether as a result of the plague or from some other cause, Hárekr now showed himself ready to come to terms with Lewis, and for the next 80 years there was complete peace along the Eider boundary. The whole of the coast was still open to attack however. Frisia was hardly ever free from invaders. Brittany was obliged to buy off Danish attacks in 847, while Noirmoutier continued to form a basis of attack against southern France in the Gironde district. The Viking invasions in France had attained much the same stage as that to which we have already traced them in England and Ireland. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3. The Vikings in England to the death of Harthacnut. The great development of Viking activity which took place after 855, was certainly not unconnected with the course of events in Denmark itself. Hárekr was attacked by his two nephews in 850 and compelled to share the kingdom with them. In 854, large bands of Vikings returned to their fatherland after 20 years ravaging in Frankish territory. Trouble now arose between Hárekr and his nephew Godurm (Old Norse Guðormr), one of the returned leaders. Civil war broke out and ultimately, after a great fight, the kingship fell on a younger Hárekr, a relative of the late king. A severe dynastic struggle of this kind must have been accompanied by much unsettlement and perhaps by an actual proscription. It would certainly seem that there was some definite connection between these events and the coincident appearance of the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok as leaders of a more extended Viking movement both in England and in France. Three of his sons, Halfdanr, Ubbi and Ivar, took part in the first wintering in Sheppey in 855, while in the same year another son, Björn Ironside, appeared on the Seine. The figure of Ragnar Lothbrok himself belongs to an earlier generation, and great as was his after fame, we unfortunately know very little of his actual career. He would seem to have been of Norwegian birth, closely connected with the south of Norway and the house of Gudröðr, and like that prince having extensive interests in Denmark. He probably visited Ireland in 831, for we read in Saxo of an expedition made by Ragnar to Ireland when he slew King Melbricus and ravaged Dublin, an event which is pretty certainly to be identified with an attack made on the Conile district (Co Louth) by foreigners in 831 when the king Malbrigde was taken prisoner. He led the disastrous Seine expedition in 845. The next glimpse of him which we have is probably that found in certain Irish annals, where he is represented as exiled from his Norwegian patrimony and living with some of his sons in the Orkneys, while others were absent on expeditions to the British Isles, Spain and Africa. And a runic inscription has been found at Maeshowe in the Orkneys confirming the connection of the sons of Lothbrok and possibly of Lothbrok himself with those islands. The expeditions would be those mentioned above, and yet more famous one made to Spain, Africa and Italy by Björn Ironside in the years 859 to 62. Ragnar Lothbrok's later history is uncertain. According to the Irish annals quoted above, his sons while on their expedition dreamed that their father had died in a land not his own, and on their return found it to be true. This agrees with Scandinavian tradition, according to which Ragnar met his death at the hands of Aelle, king of Northumbria, by whom he was thrown into a snake pit, while the capture of York by Ivar the Boneless in 866-7 is represented as part of a great expedition of vengeance undertaken by the sons of Ragnar. This tradition (apart from certain details) is probably historical, but we have no definite confirmatory evidence. With this note on the history of Denmark at this time and on the career of the most shadowy, if at the same time the most famous of the Viking leaders, we may turn once more to the history of events in England. For 10 years after the wintering in Sheppey, England was left in a state of comparative peace. The change came in 866 when a large Danish force, which had been bribed to leave the Seine by Charles the Bald, sailed to England and took up its quarters in East Anglia. In 867 they crossed the Humber and captured York, the task being made easier by the quarrels of Aelle and Osbert as to the kingship of Northumbria. Next year the rivals patched up their differences, but failed to recapture York from the Danes under Ivar and Ubbi. Setting up a puppet king, Ecgbert, in Northumbria north of the Tyne, the Danes next received the submission of Mercia and returned to York in 869. In 870 they marched through Mercia into East Anglia as far as Thetford, engaged the forces of Edmund, king of East Anglia, defeated and slew him, whether in actual battle or in later martyrdom as popular tradition would have it, is uncertain. The death of St Edmund, king and martyr, soon became an event of European fame, and no Viking leader was more widely execrated than the cruel Ivar, who was deemed responsible. The turn of Wessex came next. The fortunes of battle fluctuated, but the accounts usually terminate with the ominous words, "The Danes held possession of the battlefield." In 871 Alfred commenced his heroic struggle with the Danes, and in the first year of his reign some 9 pitched battles were fought, besides numerous small engagements. So keen was the West Saxon resistance that a truce was made in 871 and the Danes turned their attention to Mercia once more. London was forced to ransom itself at a heavy price, and a coin of Halfdanr, probably minted in London at the time, has been found. After a hurried visit to Northumbria, the here settled down for the winter of 872-3 at Torksey in the Lindsey district, whence they moved in 873 to Repton in Derbyshire. They overthrew Burhred of Mercia and set up a foolish thane of his as puppet ruler of that realm. In the winter of 874-5 the here divided forces. One part went under Halfdanr to the Tyne valley, the other under Guthorm (Old Norse Guthormr) to Cambridge. In 876 Halfdanr divided up the lands of Northumbria among his followers, who soon ploughed and cultivated them. At the same time they did not forget their old occupations. Raids were made against the Picts and the Strathclyde Welsh, while Halfdanr soon became involved in the great struggle going on in Ireland at that time between Norsemen and Danes. This ultimately led to his death in 877. In the meantime the struggle continued in Wessex. In 875 Alfred captured 7 Danish ships. In 876 the southern division of the here slipped past the West Saxon fyrd and reached Wareham in Dorsetshire, but came to terms with Alfred. Though the peace was sworn with all solemnity on their sacred altar ring, the mounted portion of the here slipped off once more and established themselves in Exeter. Their land forces were supported by a parallel movement of the fleet. At Exeter Alfred made peace with them and the here returned to Mercia. There half the land was divided up among the Danes, while the southern half was left in the hands of Ceolwulf. Alfred reached the nadir of his fortunes when the here returned to Wessex in the winter of 877-8, drove many of the inhabitants into exile across the sea, and received the submission of the rest with the exception of King Alfred and a few followers who took refuge on the island of Athelney amid the Somersetshire marshes. Alfred soon gathered round him a force with which he was able to issue from his stronghold and ultimately to inflict a great defeat on the Danes at Edington near Westbury. They now made terms with Alfred by the Peace of Wedmore and agreed to leave Alfred's kingdom while their king Guthrum received Christian baptism. They withdrew first to Cirencester and then to East Anglia. Here they settled, portioning out the lands as they had done in Northumbria and northern Mercia. A peace was drawn up between Alfred and Guthrum of East Anglia, defining the boundary between their realms. It was to run along the Thames estuary to the mouth of the Lee (a few miles east of London), then up the Lee to its source near Leighton Buzzard, and due north to Bedford, then eastwards up to the Ouse to Watling Street, somewhere near Fenny or Stony Stratford. From this point the boundary is left undefined, probably because the kingdoms of Alfred and Guthrum ceased to be conterminous here. England now had peace for some 12 years. Alfred made good use of the interval in reorganising his army and strengthening the kingdom generally, so that when attacks were renewed in 892 he was much better prepared to meet them. In the autumn of that year 2 fleets coming from France arrived in England. One landed on the Limen (between Hythe and Romney Marsh), the other under the leadership of Hæsten (O. N. Hæstein) at Milton in North Kent. Alfred's difficulties were increased by the fact that during the next 4 years the Danish settlers in Northumbria and East Anglia played a more or less actively hostile part, both by land and sea. The Danes showed all their old mobility and in a series of raids crossed England more than once. First to Buddington on the Severn (co. Montgomery), then to Chester, and on a third occasion to Bridgnorth in Shropshire. They met with a uniformly stout and well organised resistance under the leadership of Alfred, his son Edward the Elder, and his brother-in-law Aethelred of Mercia, and in the end they had to retire with no fresh acquisition of territory. For the most part they distributed themselves among the East Anglian and Northumbrian Danes, but those who had no cattle wherewith to stock their land took ship and sailed back to the Seine. There were no further attacks from abroad during Alfred's reign, but piratical raids made by the East Anglian and Northumbrian Danes caused him a good deal of trouble, and in order to meet them he definitely addressed himself to the long delayed task of equipping a fleet. The vessels were carefully designed according to Alfred's own ideas. They were larger, swifter and steadier than the Danish vessels, and they soon showed their worth when more than 20 vessels with their crews were lost by the Danes in 1 year. It is interesting to note that these vessels were manned in part by Frisian sailors, probably because of the low ebb to which England seamanship had sunk. When once Edward the Elder's claim to the throne was firmly established in the battle fought at the Holm, somewhere in South Cambridgeshire, he commenced, with the active co-operation of his brother-in-law Aethelred, Ealdorman of Mercia, the great work of strengthening the hold of the English on southern Mercia preparatory to an attempt to reconquer the Danelagh. Chester was rebuilt in 907. In 910 a fort was built at Bramesbrig, possibly Bromesberrow, in Gloucestershire. Ethelred died in the next year, but his wife Ethelflide, the Lady of the Mercians, continued his work, and forts were built at Skergiat, perhaps Shrewsbury, at Bridgnorth on the Severn, at Tamworth and at Stafford in 912. In 914 Warwick was fortified, while in 915 forts were built at Chirbury in Shropshire and Runcorn in Cheshire. On the death of Aethelred, Edward took London and Oxford and the parts of Mercia adhering to them into his own hands. 2 forts were built on the north and south sides of the Lee at Hertford in 911-12 and another at Witham on the Blackwater in Essex. Edward's work soon bore fruit, for we read that in the same year a large number of those who had been under Danish rule now made submission to the king. The Danes in the 5 boroughs became restless under the continued advance of the English, and twice in the year 913 they made raids from Leicester and Northampton as far as Hook Norton in Oxfordshire and Leighton Buzzard. Well, in the next year Edward, for the first time in his reign, was troubled by raiders from abroad. Coming from Brittany they sailed up the Severn, ravaged South Wales and the Archenfield district of Herefordshire, but could do nothing against the garrison of Gloucester, Hereford and other neighbouring towns, which seem already to have been fortified. They were forced to leave the district, and so careful a watch did Edward keep over the coast of Somerset, Devon and Cornwall that they could make no effective landing, though they tried twice, at Porlock and at Watchet. Ultimately they took up their quarters in the islands of Flatholm and Steepholm in the Bristol Channel, but lack of food soon drove them away to Ireland in a starving condition. In the same year Edward built 2 forts at Buckingham, one on each side of the Ouse, and his policy again found speedy justification when Earl Thurcytel (Old Norse Thorkell) and all the chief men who obeyed Bedford, together with many of those who obeyed Northampton, submitted to him. Everything was now ready for the great advance against the Danes. Derby fell in 917, while in the next year Leicester yielded without a struggle. Their fall was accompanied by the submission of the men of Derbyshire and Leicestershire. At the same time the inhabitants of York declared themselves ready to enter the service of Mercia. Edward fortified Bedford in 915, Malden and Towcester in South Northamptonshire in 916. Again the Danes from Northampton and Leicester tried to break through the steadily narrowing ring of forts, and they managed to get as far south as Aylesbury, while others from Huntingdon and East Anglia built a fort at Tempsford in Bedfordshire, near the junction of the Ivel and the Ouse. They besieged a fort at Wiggingamere (unidentified), but were forced to withdraw. Edward gathered an army from the nearest garrison towns, besieged, captured and destroyed Tempsford (915). In the autumn he captured Colchester and a Danish attempt on Malden failed. Edward now strengthened Towcester and received the submission of Earl Thurfrith (O. N. Thoroddr) and all the Danes in Northamptonshire as far north as the Welland. Huntingdon was occupied about the same time, and the ring of forts around East Anglia brought about the submission of the whole of that district, Cambridgeshire making a separate compact on its own account. In 918 Edward built a fort just south of Stamford and soon received the submission of the Danes of South Lincolnshire, and in the same year occupied Nottingham, building a fort and garrisoning it with a mixed English and Danish force. He was now ruler of the whole of Mercia, owing to the death of his sister Ethelflide, and in 919 he fortified Thelwall in Cheshire, on the Mersey, and rebuilt the old Roman fort at Manchester. In 920 he built a second fort at Nottingham and one at Bakewell in Derbyshire. The reconquest of the Danelagh was complete, and Edward now received the submission of the Scots, the Strathclyde Welsh, of Regnold (Old Norse Roggenvalder) of Northumbria, and of English, Danes and Norsemen alike. The Danish settlers accepted the sovereignty of the West Saxon king and henceforward formed part of an expanded Wessex which had consolidated its power over all England south of a line drawn roughly from the Humber to the Dee. The submission of Roggenvalder, king of Northumbria, and the mention of Norsemen need some comment. On the death of Halfdanr in 877, an interregnum of 7 years ensued, and then, in accordance with instructions given by St Cuthbert in a vision to Abbot Eadred of Carlisle, the Northumbrians chose a certain Guthred (Old Norse Gudrodr) as their king. He was possibly a nephew of the late king, ruled till 894, and was also known as Cnut (Old Norse Knutr). We have coins bearing the inscription Elfrid Rex on the obverse and Cnut Rex on the reverse, indicating apparently some overlordship of King Alfred. Together with these we have some coins with Cnut Rex on the obverse and Sifredus or Sivert on the reverse, and others minted at Ibroke Civitas i.e. York with the sole inscription Sifredus Rex. This latter king would seem to have been first a subordinate partner and then, on Gudrodr's death, sole ruler of Northumbria. Other coins belonging to about the same period and found in the great Curedale hoard near Preston bear the inscription Citric Comes, and there is good reason to believe that Sifredus (Old Norse Sigrodr) and Citric (Old Norse Sigtryggr) are to be identified with Sigfrith and Sitriok, who just at this time are mentioned in the Irish annals as rival leaders of the Norsemen in Dublin. The identification is important as it shows us that Northumbria was now being brought into definite connection with the Norse kingdom of Dublin, and that the Norse element was asserting itself at the expense of the Danish in northern England. The rule of Sigröðr and Sigtryggr alike had come to an end by 911, and we know nothing more until the year 918 when a fresh invasion from Ireland took place under a certain Rögnvaldr. He gained a victory at Corbridge on Tyne and captured York in 919 or 920. He divided the lands of St Cuthbert among his followers but died in 921, the year of his submission to the overlordship of Edward. The Irish annals speak of him as king of white and black foreigners alike, thus emphasising the composite settlement of Northumbria. Another leader from Ireland, one Sigtryggr, succeeded Rögnvaldr as king of Northumbria. He was on friendly terms with Aethelstan and married his sister in 925. He died in 926 or 927, and then Aethelstan took Northumbria under his own control. Sigtryggr's brother Guðröðr submitted to Aethelstan, but after 4 days at the court of King Aethelstan he returned to piracy as a fish to the sea. Both Sigtryggr and Guðröðr left sons bearing the name Anlaf (Old Norse Olafur), and with them Aethelstan and his successors had much trouble. Anlaf Sihtricsson lived in exile in Scotland and gradually organised against Aethelstan a great confederacy of Scots, Strathclyde Welsh and Vikings, both Danish and Norwegian. Anlaf Godfreyson brought help from Ireland and the great struggle began. The course of the campaign is uncertain, but if the site of its main battle, Brunanburh, is to be identified with Birrenswark Hill in southeast Dumfriesshire, it would seem that Aethelstan carried the war into the enemy's country. The result of the battle was a complete victory for the forces of Aethelstan and his brother Edmund. Constantine's son, 5 kings and 7 jarls were among the slain. We have in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle a poem celebrating the victory, and it describes in vivid language the hurried return home of Constantine, lamenting the death of his son, and the headlong flight of Anlaf Godfreyson to Dublin. England had been freed from its greatest danger since the days of King Alfred and his struggle with Guthrum. Aethelstan had no more trouble with the Norsemen, and we have evidence from other sources that at some time during his reign, probably at an earlier date, he exchanged embassies with Harold Fairhair, king of Norway. The latter sent him a present of a ship with a golden prow and purple sails, and the usual bulwark of shields along the gunwale, while Harold's favourite son, Hákon, was brought up at Aethelstan's court. There he was baptised and educated and is known in Norse history as Hákon Aethelstanes Fóstri. After the death of Aethelstan, Anlaf Sihtricsson, nicknamed Cuaran, i.e. with the sock or brogue of leather, so called from his Irish dress, came to England and captured York. From there he made an attempt to conquer the Danish district of the 5 boroughs. He seems to have got a good part of Mercia into his hands, but in the end Edmund freed the Danes from Norse oppression and took once more into his hands all Mercia south of a line from Dorey (near Sheffield) to Whitwell (Derbyshire), and thence to the Humber. Edmund and Anlaf came to terms, but Anlaf was driven out by the Northumbrians in 943, and in the next year that province fell into the hands of Edmund. In 947 Eric Bloodaxe, son of Harold Fairhair, was accepted as king by the Northumbrians. In Scandinavian tradition we learn how he was expelled from Norway in 934 by the supporters of Hákon, went on Viking raids in the west, was appointed ruler of Northumbria by Aethelstan on condition of his defending it against attack, but was not on good terms with Edmund, who favoured one Olaf. Probably Eric retired after Aethelstan's death and only returned to England in 947. In 948 Edmund forced the Northumbrians to abandon his cause and about the same time Anlaf returned from Ireland and ruled till about 950, when he was replaced by Eric, whose short rule came to an end in 954. In that year he was expelled by the Northumbrians and killed at Stainmoor in Westmorland. The attempt to establish a Norse kingdom of Northumbria had failed, and henceforward that district was directly under the rule of the English king. English authority was supreme once more, even in those districts which were largely peopled with Scandinavian settlers. England had no further trouble with Norse or Danish invaders until the days of Ethelred the Unready, but no sooner did that weak and ill-advised king come to the throne than, with that ready and intimate knowledge of local conditions which they always displayed, we find Danes making an attack on Southampton and Norsemen one on Chester. The renewed attacks were not, however, due solely to the weakness of England. They were also the result of changed conditions in Scandinavia itself. In Denmark the reign of Harold Bluetooth was drawing to a close, and the younger generation, conscious of a strong and well organised nation behind them, were ambitious of new and larger conquests, while at the same time many of them were in revolt against the definitely Christian policy of Harold in his old age. They turned with hope towards his young son Svein and found in him a ready and willing leader. In Norway Earl Hakon had broken away from the suzerainty of Harold Bluetooth, but the Norwegians could not forget that he owed his throne to a foreign power, and his personal harshness and licentiousness, as well as his zealous cult of the old heathen rites, were a cause of much discontent. The hopes of the younger generation were fixed on Olaf Tryggvason, a man filled with the spirit of the old Vikings. Captured by pirates from Estonia when still a child, he was discovered, ransomed and taken to Novgorod, where he entered the service of the Grand Duke Vladimir. Furnished by him with a ship, he went Viking in the Baltic, and then 10 years later we find him prominent among the Norsemen who attacked England in the days of King Ethelred. In 991 a Norse fleet under Olaf visited Ipswich and Malden. Here they met with a stout resistance headed by the brave Byrhtnoth, Earl of Essex, and in the fragmentary lay of the fight at Malden, which has been preserved to us, we see that there was still much of the spirit of the heroic age left in the English nation even in the days of Ethelred II. It was to buy off this attack that a payment of Danegeld to the extent of some £10,000 was made. From Malden Olaf went to Wales and Anglesey, and it was somewhere in the west that he received knowledge of the Christian faith from an anchorite and was baptised. He did not however renounce his Viking life, but joined forces with his great Danish contemporary Svein Forkbeard. Bamborough was sacked in 993, and both were present at the siege of London in 994 when they sailed up the Thames with 490 ships. The attack was a failure and Olaf came to terms with Ethelred, agreeing to desist from further attack in return for a payment of £16,000 of Danegeld. Olaf was the more ready to make this promise as he was now addressing himself to the task of gaining the sovereignty of Norway itself. Many of the Norsemen returned with Olaf, but the attacks on the coast continued and the invaders, chiefly Danes now, ravaged the country in all directions. Treachery was rife in the English forces, and again the ealdormen failed in the hour of need. Danegeld after Danegeld was paid in the vain hope of buying off further attacks, and the almost incredible sum of £158,000 of silver (i.e. some £500,000) was paid as Danegeld during a period of little more than 20 years. Once or twice Ethelred showed signs of energy, once in 1000 when a fleet was sent to Chester which ravaged the Isle of Man while an army devastated Cumberland, and again in 1004 when a great fleet was made ready but ultimately proved of no use. Ethelred's worst stroke of policy was the order given in 1002 for the massacre on St Brice's Day of all Danes settled in England. His orders were carried out only too faithfully, and among the slain was Svein's sister Gunnhild, the wife of a Danish jarl in the king's service. Svein's vengeance was relentless, and during the next 10 years the land had no peace until in 1013 Ethelred was driven from the throne and Svein himself became king of England. Svein died in 1014 and his son Cnut succeeded to his claim. Ethelred was invited by the Witan to return, and ultimately Wessex fell to Cnut, while the district of the Seven Boroughs (the Old Five together with York and Chester) and Northumbria passed into the hands of Ethelred, or rather of his energetic son Edmund. This division of the country placing the district once settled by Danes and Norsemen under an English king, while the heart of England itself was in the possession of a Scandinavian king, shows how completely the settlers in those districts had come to identify themselves with English interests as a whole. Mercia was nominally in Ethelred's power, but its ealdorman, Eadric Streona, was the most treacherous of all the English earls. On Ethelred's death in 1016, the Witan chose Edmund Ironside as king, and a series of battles took place culminating in that at Ashington in Essex, where the English were completely defeated through the treachery of Eadric. A division of the kingdom was now made whereby Wessex fell to Edmund, Mercia and Northumbria to Cnut. Thus easily was the allegiance of the various districts transferred from one sovereign to another. Edmund only lived a few months and Cnut then became king of all England. For 20 years the land enjoyed peace and prosperity. In 1018 the greater part of the Danish army and fleet returned to Denmark, some 40 ships and their crews sufficing Cnut for the defence of his kingdom. During the next 4 years he received the submission of the King of Scotland and made a memorable pilgrimage to Rome. The most important event of his latter years was, however, his struggle with Olaf the Stout, the great St Olaf of Norway. Norway was now entirely independent of Danish sovereignty, and when Cnut sent an embassy voicing the old claims of the Danish kings he received a proudly independent answer from St Olaf. For the time being Cnut had to be satisfied, but in 1025 he sailed with a fleet to Norway, only to suffer defeat at the Battle of the Helge Au (i.e. Holy River) in Skane, at the hands of the united forces of Norway and Sweden. 3 years later the attack was renewed. Olaf's strenuous and often cruel advocacy of the cause of Christianity had alienated many of his subjects, and the Swedes had deserted their ally. The result was that Olaf fled to Russia and Cnut was declared king of Norway. 2 years later the exile returned and fell fighting against his own countrymen. Cnut was now the mightiest of all Scandinavian kings, but on his death in 1035 his empire fell apart. Norway went to his son Svein, Denmark to Harthacnut, and England to Harold Harefoot. Harold was succeeded by Harthacnut in 1040, but neither king was of the same stamp as Cnut, and they were both overshadowed by the great Godwine, Earl of Wessex. When Harthacnut died in 1042, the male line in descent from Cnut was extinct, and though some of the Danes were in favour of choosing Cnut's sister's son Svein, Godwine secured the election of Edward the Confessor. With the accession of Edward, Danish rule in England was at an end, and, except for the ambitious expedition of Harold Hardrada, foiled at Stamford Bridge in 1066, there was no further serious question of a Scandinavian kingship either in or over England. The sufferings of England during the second period of invasion (980 to 1016) were probably quite as severe as in the worst days of Alfred. The well-known Sermo Lupi ad Anglos, written by Archbishop Wulfstan of York in 1014, draws a terrible picture of the chaos and anarchy then prevailing. But we must remember that neither these years nor the ensuing 35 years of Danish kingship left as deep a mark on England as the earlier wars and the settlements resulting from them. There was no further permanent occupation or division of territory, and though some of the earldoms and the great estates passed into the hands of the king's Danish followers, there was no transformation of the whole social life of the people such as had taken place in the old Danelagh districts. End of chapter 3.